Get your sense of what some political parties make of this decision. Bring in our guest, IFP President Velenkosini Hlabisa. His counterpart in the UDM is Bantu Holomisa. Also joining our discussion is the DA's Cilliers Brink. To all three of our guests, thanks very much indeed for your time. And of course, Bantu Holomisa joins us via our telephone line. It's great to see you all. Let me begin with you, Cilliers. I mean, you know, the DA has been quite outspoken about how the government had actually handled the powers that were afforded to it according to the Disaster Management Act in carrying out the state of disaster. I guess with the benefit of hindsight, are you pleased with how they got us here?
So the DA welcomes finally the end of the national state of disaster. This decision could have been taken months ago because for long now, COVID-19 no longer conforms to any reasonable definition of a disaster. And I think the government's hand has finally been forced. The public and political pressure has finally compelled the government to make this decision. And this is welcome because real disaster relief and recovery should have started a while ago. And we've got to signal to the rest of the world that South Africa is returning to normality, that the tourists can come back, that the businesses are open again, so that we can get the investment needed to create jobs and to relieve poverty and to continue the project of growing the economy that was underway before this lockdown. What we are concerned about as the DA is the fact that it seems the government now wants to transplant its lockdown powers from the Disaster Management Act to health regulations, so making the power to lock down society effectively permanent. And we're particularly concerned about provisions in these draft national health regulations, which the public have until the 16th of April to comment on, that will give government the power to declare a very vague and undefined thing called a notifiable illness. And if you're suspected of having this notifiable illness, the government can compel you to undergo tests, examinations, and even mandatory medication. And so the DA will be objecting to these regulations, and we encourage the public as well to comment on the regulations, because the last thing we want is a government with permanent lockdown powers.
Yeah, let me just stay with that. I mean, which part of the regulations are you referring to here, Cilliers? Just for clarity's sake.
So the competency in those regulations, if passed, will enable government to, once a notifiable illness has been declared, and again, as I mentioned before, a notifiable illness in these regulations hasn't been clearly defined. Once such an illness has been declared by government, the executive will gain the power to impose mask mandates, restrictions on gatherings, all of the powers that it had under the national state of disaster. But in addition, and what our main concern is the power to submit or to compel people to submit to mandatory examinations, tests, and even medication. Now that is coercive, and no government should have those powers in advance. If government needs to deal with a health disaster or any other disaster, the measures need to be carefully considered at that time. We can't give government a blank check to exercise these kinds of powers over society in advance. And as we know, many of the disaster management regulations have been abused in the past. Not necessary to contain COVID-19, and it harmed the economy, it harmed society, and it led to the misappropriation of public funds. COVID-19 relief funds were stolen under the cover of what was supposed to be disaster powers.
Okay.
So these are our concerns.
Got you. Let me bring in the IFP's President Velenkosini Hlabisa. I'm sure you've also been listening and following the developments over the past couple of months, actually, as pressure was mounting on government to finally lift the national state of disaster. Among the things that were ventilated in those discussions is the need for some kind of parliamentary oversight if we ever get to another stage where we need to implement something like these measures in response to something like a pandemic. Is that cause that you would back as the IFP?
First of all, good morning, Ayanda, as well as the viewers of this program. The IFP welcomes the removal of the state of the national disaster as announced by the president yesterday. And we hope the country is getting into a new level, into a new stage of once again to reopen the economy in its fullest and attend to all businesses that were hardly hit by the pandemic. We hope the government is going to utilize the resources available to inject to especially small businesses that were hardly affected. As you have said, we believe that it is up to now the government, the parliament should play a high oversight role, as we have learned a lot during the period of the pandemic, things that were not done correctly. Now, as many parliaments as well as provincial legislatures are going to be going back to full operation, we have to ensure that we play our oversight role, which has been affected by the visual platforms where we could not effectively ensure that we play our role. As the country is opening, it is up to now the citizens of our country to play their role also, to ensure that we vaccinate, because we should not put the full responsibility on the government, as it remains that indoors masks must be used. We urge the people of South Africa to take a full and personal responsibility. When a person gets sick, it does not get the government sick, but it is a person and the nation. Therefore, this calls upon all of us as individuals, as people of South Africa, political parties, to mobilize people, to vaccinate, to comply with masks indoors, so that we apprehend the spread of the virus.
Yeah. Of course, General Holomisa, what the pandemic has also done, and I'm mindful of the fact that it's not over, is that it's exposed the best and the worst in us. We saw some of the worst corruption take place at a time where, quite frankly, none of that should have been happening. I wonder whether you're feeling that we have now been shielded from that in the form of these proposed regulations as we look forward to how we could better manage something like a pandemic in this country.
It is precisely for this reason that the UDM had approached its legal advisors and I guess other parties with a view to challenge the government on all this mess up. Fortunately, Cyril Ramaphosa, the president, and his government saw it coming, and they acted with speed. Ever since we said we were going to go to court, they acted with speed. Had we not done so, this disaster act or management regulations would have been here for another year or two. So we welcome the decision to lift the state of disaster. And in terms of what they are trying to do, I've never seen regulations being made within 48 hours. That tells you that these fellows are not serious, because the people are not going to be reached throughout the country to consult them. But because they have already decided that they will continue looting the resources of this country, they are trying to hide these regulations under the Department of Health. And we are going to challenge this if we feel so in court. Currently, I'm not going to waste my time on analyzing those regulations because they are not needed. There is no disaster currently as we speak. If there's going to be a disaster in future, then the state of disaster can be brought back. But we welcome it that it has been lifted, but it must be lifted unconditionally.
I guess, and this has been answered in part, when we think about managing future pandemics, Cilliers, we obviously don't want to be repeating the kind of mistakes that have been made in this, call it the first round, dare I say. Where do the gaps lie insofar as you're concerned, if we ever do get to a stage where we need to reintroduce the state of disaster?
Well, the interesting thing about the response to COVID-19 was that many of the measures that were needed to relieve or to mitigate its strain on the health system did not, in fact, require extraordinary government powers. For example, the setting up of field hospitals and ICUs for patients with acute respiratory conditions. That did not require extraordinary government power. That just required good management and the ability to plan and to mobilize once a disaster occurs. And those types of field hospitals and additional care are crucial. Other examples, the procurement and distribution of the vaccine. South Africans forget, those who have taken the vaccine, have accepted its efficiency, we forget how long it took the government to actually go over into action, to negotiate, to prepare for distribution. And in this instance, South Africa's vaccination program was far behind much of the rest of the world. And this was concerning, especially for a middle-income country as South Africa is. Also, convincing the public of the vaccine's efficacy. This was a major flaw in the government's response to COVID-19. We all preach vaccination now, but many people are deeply distrustful of the vaccination, and that could have been countered at the outset if the health minister hadn't spent or hadn't instigated the spending of PR money on irregular activities. So many of the responses needed to cope with the disaster comes down to good government, good planning, the ability to spend money according to what it is supposed to be spent for, and to make sure that that money isn't misappropriated. One further example, the DA at the outset of the pandemic called for an inspector general to be appointed to see to it that COVID relief money isn't stolen, to check on how tenders are specified and awarded in real time so that we don't have to wait for the Auditor General. That suggestion was ignored. That required no extraordinary government powers, but it was ignored. And so I think it's very important going forward, because many disasters and emergencies can hit us.
Right.
We need effective government and effective accountability. We don't necessarily need a stronger hand